falling into the hands of the English colonizers in America had some very serious consequences. They created a slave experience that had never been known in the recorded history of mankind. And mankind from all backgrounds has done their fair share of enslaving, but none to the level of the English in America. And so in the last video, we talked about the slave society in colonial Latin America. And in this video, we're going to focus on the English slave society and show some of the key differences from that of its Latin compadre. And so to do that, we're going to read from this book here called Race in North America by social anthropologist Dr. Audrey Smedley. And so let's go in here and turn to page 145, where she writes this. All forms of colonial slavery bore numerous institutional similarities in the use and treatment of Africans as slaves. Modern historians have argued that every colony differed in some respects from others, whether Latin or English. Plantation societies, whether in Brazil or on the Caribbean islands, or in the southern United States, and whether producing tobacco, sugar, or cotton, were more similar to one another than they were to urban societies in their own territories. It was on plantations that slaves everywhere worked hardest and received the most inhumane treatment. Urban centers also tended to manifest, inter alia, meaning among other things, similarities in the kinds of work that slaves did and in the nature of personal relationships between slaves on the one hand and slave owners and other free persons on the other. But differences in colonizing powers, varying historical experiences with heterogeneity and older forms of slavery led to their devising different cultural stratagems for coping with current realities. And so what she means by this is, for example, the Spanish had a historical familiarity of dealing with a mixture of slaves from different people with different physical features and from different cultural backgrounds. And we can see from the proximity of Spain to a region like North Africa to why this was the case. But on the other hand, the English were located way out there on a little island out in the boondocks. So they had very little exposure to a diversity of people. And they simply used a lot of their energy trying to conquer the wild Irish. So the historical background of those from Spain and from England are what helped shape their approach to the colonization of the land and the minds of the people in the New World. Let's continue. In other words, the differences between the English American and Latin American slavery relate most directly to the retention of old world customs and habits in the Latin areas, irrespective of the physical diversity in the population. And so the Latins retained much of the old world slavery practices that had been going on for many thousands of years prior to them coming over to the Americas. But the English did not do so. The English, they recognized that form of slavery as being much outdated and unsuitable for their purpose. And so what did they do? They upgraded it to the 9.0 version, right? Let's keep reading. On the important issue of manumissions or freeing slaves, for example, we have seen that there are always substantial numbers of free blacks and mixed peoples in the Latin colonies. No laws prevented the emancipation of slaves. On the contrary, the laws and customs of the Iberians assumed that freedom was the natural and normal desire of human beings, and moral pressure was put on those recalcitrant slave owners who denied freedom to their slaves when it could be purchased. And recalcitrant meaning uncooperative, to authority, or unruly. And so she's saying that there was a form of pressure that was applied to those slave owners who did not allow their slaves to purchase freedom when they had the means to do so. And this is dealing with the customs of the Iberians, or those who are from the Iberian Peninsula, which is a section that extends off of the west coast of Europe and is surrounded by 3 sides of water. And from here, this is where the Spanish and the Portuguese took off to go and conquer. Let's keep reading. According to Bowser, the principles of las siete partidas viewed slavery as a necessary evil, as a transitory condition that did not alter or diminish the nature of the slave. Thus, manumission was not only possible, but, at least in Peru, the old Roman peculium, property or wages earned by slaves, was restored to provide slaves a means of income. Spanish American practices relating to the purchase of freedom, Bowser further tells us, were more liberal than that envisioned by the partidas. Moreover, several historians have noted Latins did not fear their freed slaves. Although most were poor, large numbers of freedmen worked in important crafts and professions. Many were mulattoes who did not identify with slaves or blacks. And so this is how the Latins operated in their slave society during colonial times and what to them was the New World. They didn't completely strip the humanity away from all the slaves, and they allowed for some room for freeing them according to this account. But what about the English in North America? Let's find out right now. In North America, numerous legal and customary prohibitions made private manumissions difficult or increasingly impossible from the late 17th century up to the Civil War period. And so the English, they stopped believing in freeing slaves. They began passing laws that made it illegal for the slave masters to do so. Because in the earlier stage of English colonization in North America, there were masters who were allowed to, in fact, free their slaves. But the elite barred the door from allowing that practice to continue. Here we go. North Americans everywhere feared the consequences of freeing large numbers of slaves, a fear that peaked in the first half of the 19th century, when, as will be argued, the Negro was becoming viewed and defined as subhuman, as a species apart. And so the Spanish didn't fear their slaves being freed, as Dr. Smedley already mentioned, but the English did. They were in fear that the Negro might rise up and cut them off. And this was during the time where the Negro was being viewed and defined as subhuman. What does it mean to define? That means to create this boundary around something and then give it meaning, right? And so where does this meaning exist? It exists in the world of abstract ideas. That's where it's maintained and where it takes on a life of its own. The world of ideas is what holds the pattern and the framework for all human constructed societies. And so the people constructing these identities of people and then defining people, they're the ones controlling the narrative, which also controls people's perception of reality. And so they already labeled them as Negro or as black. And the defining process, it created a definite boundary around what a Negro or a black person was. And one of the ideas that they jammed into this boundary was that these people were subhuman. Sub meaning below, right? So subhuman meaning below a human, right? As some other type of species, right? And we'll talk about this more in other videos when it comes that time and when we go into discovering this part of the pit. But this here was a major difference between how the Spanish and how the English, who at that time in the 19th century had already renamed themselves to white and redefined themselves, got busy. But let's keep going. North American slaves had no refuge from and no rights to redress against cruel or unusual punishment, and they could not sue through the courts and request to be sold to another master, as was often the case under old world slavery and as was found in the Latin colonies. In North America, from the early 18th century on, outside of the northern colonies, slave marriages were not considered legitimate or legally binding on the master, and there was no institutionalized religious pressure to recognize them. And so in Latin America, those marriages were often recognized. And Dr. Audrey Smedley talks about how the church pressured the Spanish men to marry those of African and native descent in order to legitimize the children that they had, right? But the English weren't having any of this. Let's keep going. It was an arbitrary decision on the part of an owner to permit slaves to enter into any form of connubiality, meaning the English slave master made the decision if he wanted the couple to marry or not. The enslaved didn't have any rights or any say-so in regards to marriage. It was all up to the owner's discretion. There was indeed no acceptance of the need for effective relationships between male and female slaves. On the contrary, slave women were thought of only as workers or as breeders and concubines at best. And so pay attention to the language that the doctor uses. She said that they were thought of, which is another form of defining. And so the Negro slave woman was thought of or defined as only being a worker or a breeder and a concubine at best. And you can imagine the psychological effect that this has on a person when an entire society thinks this about a person, including the Negroes as well, who came to believe this about themselves. How would that shape the culture that they formed from those types of thoughts that they had about themselves? I want you to think about that, right? Let's keep going. The slave codes gave the master complete discretion in the matter of separating husband and wife or mother and children, and virtually total control over the welfare of the slaves. And so this is the English we're talking about, right? With that 9.0 version of slavery that they brought out. It was in the matter of female slaves and their children by their masters or other white men that North American racial slavery contrasted most sharply with the practices and customs of the Old World and the slavery of Latin American colonies. Historical records from the biblical accounts of Sarah and Abraham to the laws of Islam show that it was customary for a woman slave who had a child by their master to be protected from further sale and even to be allotted heightened status within the household. It comes as no surprise that Brazilians and foreigners alike acknowledged that the offspring of unions of masters with slave women were accepted as part of the family. And so who colonized the landmass where Brazil is at? It was the Portuguese, and they still practiced much of the old world customs. And they had a concept about the enslaved that was different from that of the English. And part of that was that they could accept the offspring from the slave and the master into the family, right? Which the English in the southern colonies would have never done, right? They would have never done that, at least on any widespread scale, right? Let's keep going. Nothing prevented Portuguese or Spanish settlers from recognizing their children by Indian or African women except their own personal inclinations and values. This was not so in North America, although miscegenation manifested itself early in the history of the colonies and, by the first part of the 18th century, mulatto offspring constituted a sizable and recognizable demographic reality, albeit not nearly as substantial as in Latin America. There was no customary provision for a slave woman's security or that of her children, and the system did not permit a change of her status under law. Indeed, North Americans obfuscated the fact and denied any separate social recognition to offspring of mixed parentage. Such children were not permitted by law or custom to be liberated, be acknowledged by their fathers, or be claimed as their heirs. In very few instances in the South or North did the mulatto descendant of white slave masters have legal access to the status or property of their fathers, even on those few occasions when they were emancipated, a clear indication that the ideology of race superseded other status dimensions. And that's how the tool of race was used to keep all non-whites in a lower social class, and especially if it was someone classified as black. It didn't matter how much wealth they had, how much land they owned, how white the father was, right? However you want to call it. The fact is that label as black superseded everything else in the eyes of that society. And they purposely designed it to be that way. Let's keep reading. The economic or social implications of this prohibition or taboo on paternal recognition have been far-reaching. The North American black population today derives an average of about 30% of its biogenetic ancestry from Europeans, due initially to the mating of masters and slave women, right? Something to think about. The critical difference in the attitudes of Latin American and North American slave masters and overall society towards their offspring by slave women cannot be fully explained by the demographic and economic facts adduced by recent scholars, who relate the frequency of sexual union with Indian and or African women to the ratios of white men to white women. In the Latin colonies, men came to explore and exploit the land and people for wealth, and generally did not bring their women with them. Consequently, it is argued they established sexual liaisons with Indian and African women. In the early 16th century, both the Portuguese and the French cultivated alliances and cooperation with the Indians. They sent boys and young men to live with the Indians and learn their languages. All the Latin peoples assimilated some Indians into their communities, although sometimes attempting to separate them residentially and by occupations. Here we go. They vigorously converted them and transmitted to them their languages and lifestyles. And what did they convert them to? Into Christians. And they either forcefully or through persuasion convinced them to adopt their language and their way of life, which was their culture, right? Which means that a change in ideas and beliefs had to first take place. And so under this circumstance, there were Indians that were accepted into the Latin communities, which the English don't even think about them doing this, because this is not what they would have done. Let's keep going. The English, on the other hand, systematically excluded Indians from the very beginning. You see that? The English weren't having any of this. They systematically excluded the Indians from the very beginning, meaning when they stepped foot on the land and on the soil, they already had a process in place to keep the Indians from entering into their community, right? It was already understood that the Indians were not allowed into their community. Now, this doesn't mean that the English were not cordial or friendly with the Indians at some point, because they were. But that's different from accepting them into the community like they did over there in Latin America. Let's keep reading. Nash says of this circumstance that the general lack of red-white sexual intermingling forecast the overall failure of the two cultures to merge. The Latin colonies, in contrast, produced and incorporated large mestizo populations, out of which came many outstanding cultural and political leaders. Not only was there genetic fusion, but the syncretism of Indian, Latin, and African cultures was extensive. Here we go. Talented mestizos and mulattoes were co-opted into the elite Latin community, many holding professional and skilled occupations. Now, did you hear that? They were taken into the elite parts of the Latin community. The English, they would have looked at that as a suicide mission at that point, right? There's no way that the English would have allowed mestizos or mulattoes into the elite inner circles at that time. Here we go. Watch this. Of the English colonies, Nash states, the half Indian, half white person, usually the product of a liaison between a white fur trader and an Indian woman, remained in almost all cases within the Indian society and was the most alienated of all people from the white society. The English said, take those children and keep them over there, right, in the outer courts of society. They didn't want anything to do with them within their community, and especially if we're talking about the elite portion of their community, right? That wasn't happening. They don't get down like that. That's not the English. Let's keep going. What Marvin Harris calls the rule of hypodescent, whereby children were accorded the lower status of their mothers, obtained in the cases of both Indian and black mixed offspring among the English. And that's how they rigged the game. The mother was typically the slave, and the freaky Englishmen or the white slave masters were typically the fathers, who had no self-control over their private members. And again, they used the tool of law to create an escape hatch out of this situation by making the kids take the status of their mothers. Let's keep reading. We have seen that some scholars have argued against the importance of Europeans' previous cultural attitudes in determining their patterns of colonial interaction. Nash reminds us of the Statutes of Kilkenny, which forbade the intermarriage of English settlers with the Irish, and the general English cultural predisposition seen in previous chapters to keep themselves apart. Nash comes much closer to the truth when he states that Englishmen objected not so much to the sexual relations with rich-skinned women, but to conferring status on them by accepting such intermingling as legitimate or by admitting its product to white society. It was exclusion from the English society that was the goal. And so they didn't have a problem indulging in these private parties with women with rich brown skin or having children with them. But they did have a problem with allowing those children to enter into the white society, because that would have obviously weakened the social structure that they had set up, which the higher echelons depended upon this idea of the white race being a peer group, right, with distinguishable physical features, and anything that was outside of that was not permitted, right? It had to stay outside somewhere else. And the English elite, they stuck rigidly to this game plan because they had a long-term vision for the society that they were structuring. Let's keep going. The Portuguese and Spanish were also protective of their status, but they never erected exclusive categories and were much less rigid in their proscriptions. It seems, then, that the worldview of Latin colonists was from the beginning very different from that of the English, primarily because of their varying experiences with human diversity. And this is what we talked about earlier, with the Spanish having much more historical familiarity with various cultures and the English not having much. The Latin colonists accepted Africans in a wider variety of roles, from free men of diverse social status to the lowest of slaves, just as they had in the Old World. But look what she says next. With the passage of time and increased importation of Africans, Latin colonists came to associate rich skins with slave status, but the correspondence was neither precise nor comprehensive. In the 19th century, Latin Americans came under the influence of the race ideology of North America. They tried to take some of the pages out of the book of the English. But because of the extensive intermixtures of people, among other historical and cultural factors, it was impossible to incorporate all of the ideological components of race as they had developed in North America. And so that's something that they should have considered from the very beginning, like the English did. Don't come up later on trying to implement it, because the 19th century was already too late for them. Because of the inability to structure phenotypically based separate and exclusive groups, none of the other components of race were institutionalized in Latin America as formidably and as widely as in the United States. Ranking and inequality were, and still are, heavily predicated on social factors including income, education, inherited wealth, language, occupation, and lifestyle, which long predated the tricontinental mixing of people. This is so despite the retention of linguistic evidence suggesting phenotype-based categories. Post-colonial developments revealed a clear preference for whiteness, in emulation of European and American values, but the race concept was never as rigidly and firmly established in the Latin colonial world as it was in pre-Civil War North America. And so not everyone played the game of domination as well or as rigid and hardcore as the English did. They had a game plan and they stuck to it, and it worked out very well. And part of that game is still being played today, and is still controlling the very fabric of the entire society. And so the question is, who's going to escape out of the hand of the English? Who out there can find their way out of the complex pit that these people dug many centuries ago? In other words, who can outmaneuver and sidestep the plans of the English elite? Or were these people just too hardcore and too rugged for your level of consciousness? The answer is up to you, right? It's in your own hands. And so with that said, hopefully this video has given you some extra light to find your way on the path, to get some understanding on how this social system was set up, right? And so I want to thank you for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.